So my name is Michael. I'm an alcoholic. The date of my last drink is August 6, 1994. Yeah, I woke up August 7th of 1994, and I realized I was graced with the understanding and the feeling and the desire that I didn't want to drink anymore. And what that really was like, I realized that if I drank again, that I wouldn't be able to control it, and that would lead to my death, right? That's kind of big, right? Except for the fact that up until that point, I'd been living my life as if I wanted to die. So the realization that I didn't want to die was a really profound one, right? I'd been going to meetings for about 4 months at that point because I had to, and that started me off on the path to where I am today. So how did I get there, though? I like to start talking about my childhood, not that it has a whole lot of bearing on the fact that I'm an alcoholic, because the reason that I'm an alcoholic is that I drank to a point where I got my body to a state that if I ingest alcohol, then I'm going to want more alcohol, and that my mind is twisted enough that if I'm drinking alcohol, then I'm going to be obsessed with it and want to drink more until it kills me. Regardless of how I got that way, I got that way. But the childhood stuff comes into play. So I grew up in Michigan. That's where I'm from originally. My parents were married until I was 10, roughly. And it was good, you know. They seemed to get along. I had an older brother. Everything's, to me, I didn't know if anything was bad or anything like that. Things were just fine for me. We went to church every Sunday, and I kind of liked it. I felt right when I was, when I was in church, I kind of felt right when I was younger. And then I got a little older. I'm talking like 6. And I thought of a question, and I asked my parents, and they're like, ask the pastor at the church. And I asked the pastor at the church, and he kind of sloughed it off, like, I don't need to answer this question of a 6-year-old, And then I thought, oh, well, they don't want to get serious about this, then I won't be serious about this either, right? But we went to church, and I remember drifting off in the, from the sanctuary and kind of roaming around. I've spent in my life far more time in the halls and fellowship halls and any other place in a church than the sanctuary. A lot of that has to do with going to AA. But so anyway, we suddenly stopped kind of going. We kind of stopped going to church when I was about 9, or we missed a few weeks in a row, and then we kind of stopped going. And then I remember one Sunday we went to church, and then we came back, and I was in my room. And I looked out the window, and there's some woman from church was coming up the thing, and my parents said, "Hey guys, stay in your rooms for a while." Okay. And then I saw her, because I saw her walk back out to her car, and looked like she was kind of crying and all this kind of stuff, and I'm like, that's weird. So then my parents called me out, and my brother and I out, and informed us that they were getting divorced. That the minister at the church and his wife were getting divorced, and that, well, basically that was what they informed us at that point. But what happened was that 6 months after 6 months after the pastor at our church got divorced from his wife, my mom and dad were already divorced, and my mom and the pastor got married. And by then, so needless to say, I was with my dad. My brother and I stayed with my dad after my parents split up, and Mom went off and got married and started her life with the pastor, and we stopped going to church. I talk about that because that was clearly, obviously, a turning point in my life, but it does inform sort of what my story is around here too. Things obviously were different. I learned how to cook. I learned how to do my own laundry. It took a while to learn how to clean the house because my dad hired my cousin to come and clean the house, so I didn't have to worry about that so much. But it was really, it was my brother, my dad, and I at the house for a few years until he decided that he needed to be married again, and got remarried after dating a woman for about 3 months. She moved in. She was unpleasant, let's say. That didn't go well. There's a whole lot of stuff going on in that story that lasted about 3 years. I hadn't really started drinking at any point during this. At some point, I was what, 87? I was 15, and I think I had been drunk once at this point. Like, my brother took me to a drive-in with his buddies and everything like that, and I got drunk. And then he was driving us home and dropped off his girlfriend, and I threw up in her driveway, and I'm like, why would I want to do that? Although I loved it, but that's another story. So my dad's dad passed away, and he was getting ready to go down to the funeral in Pittsburgh, and my stepmom was trying to pack the house. And he eventually left, and then she eventually decided to try and, this is not her first time she tried this. It was more of a show, but she left the suicide note. I found it. I had to run across. Anyway, there was a big drama. She goes into counseling. We go into counseling as a family, and I shut down, right? So they decided to put me inpatient for a while. So that was my first experience with the psychological some intensive psychological treatment, we'll put it that way. But I came out of there, and basically the whole thing that I learned was I had to break out of my shell, right? I was very introverted. I had pulled away from the world already, right? Because I didn't have much of one. I didn't have a family, didn't really have many friends, all that kind of fun stuff. So my dad decided to give my brother the directive to take him out with you when you go out, because my brother was out and about and doing stuff. So he took me out and about with his buddies and friends and stuff. And my brother's, was his pastime was drinking with his buddies on the weekends. So I started drinking with my brother and his buddies on the weekends. And it happened to be that some of his buddies were like friends of mine that I knew from school and stuff. And so, when my brother kind of left the scene, I was still in that. So I started drinking real heavy as far as binging through high school on the weekends, And I showed early on that when I was drinking to get drunk. I didn't like beer. Whenever we went to the store, I would have people, everybody would pitch in and get a case or whatever beer, and I would have them get me some Yukon Jack, right? Because I could drink it straight out of the bottle, and it was 100 proof. Because why mess around? I have a point. I have a purpose to this. Sure, it's being social, but I need to get hammered to be social. So that's where I started off, and that continued on through high school. Now, as well in high school, I was a pretty good student. I ended up graduating 21st in my class out of 350. National Honor Society, played football, I was on the ski team, I played baseball, snow skiing, by the way, just so you know. I did well and all that stuff, but on the weekends, man, it was hammer down, time to party, for sure. And I just thought that was the way to do it. It didn't stop though. When I graduated, I took a year off from going to school because I resented school. I didn't want my dad to spend all the money on it that I felt like he didn't have, or however that went. I just decided not to do it. And I moved to Virginia to live with my cousin for a little while, and that was actually probably the last span of sort of early sobriety that I had. I didn't really drink down there much, but I came back up there and went to town. I ended up going to school at Eastern Michigan for about a year and a half. that really propelled my drinking forward. The last month and a half, I already knew that I wasn't going to go back. I found a guy down the hall in the dorm that was in the same situation. We knew we weren't coming back, and I had a meal plan. I had 21 meals a week. So all I had to do was scrape up enough money for him and I to buy a fifth or whatever, and we would drink that at night, overnight, like in the common room, and then go down into the eatery when it opened up for breakfast, and then I'd go to sleep during the day while everybody's at class, and get up in the evening and hang out, and then drink all night. And we'd found this stuff that one of our other friends had found. It was called Devil's Springs vodka, and it was 160 proof. So if the two of us were drinking it, it's like drinking a fifth each. So, and this dude was like, I'm a little heavier than I was then, and this guy was 6'2", 250, and I'm like, 5'7", 150 maybe, drinking down a fifth of vodka every night. So I left school, went to work, went back to work at either the job that I had when I started school, which was cutting lawns, or I ended up working at a full-service gas station and car wash. I thought that might be a good career move. So anyway, I went to trade school. I went to trade school for broadcasting. I wanted to be a DJ. During the middle of that somewhere, I got my first drunk driving. That was in 1993 in April. And it was in the city of Detroit. Now, I'm from the suburbs of Detroit, and the city of Detroit was not going to have some white kid from the suburbs really mess around down there too much, so they just really kind of slapped my wrist and said, here, pay some fines and go on your merry way, basically, and really didn't have any serious consequences of that. Except for I was on probation. So when I graduated from the trade school, the only job that I could find at first was in Ohio, and I couldn't leave the state because I was on probation. So, and I couldn't take I was cutting lawns, and I couldn't take the $1 an hour pay cut to go work in radio that it would have taken to do that. So anyway, I just continued to drink. It was at that point it turned into an everyday thing. The weekends were, more special, because I could drink all day if I wanted to, but I had kept it to just, off work hours at that point. I would go get off work, stop by the store, get a pint or a half pint of something, usually whiskey, to get me through until I could get to my buddy's place, and then we would go get stuff, and either, if it was the weekend, we would go out and drink. If it was the weekday, then, we would again, scrape together whatever we could, go up and get a fifth of 5 o'clock vodka. Yeah. You say pop off, 5 o'clock. Not good. Again, this is the point, is getting drunk. The point is to get drunk, because here's the thing. I didn't like myself. I hated who I was. I hated who I'd become. I was this guy in high school, right? And I'm 22-ish years old, and I'm drinking every night, cutting lawns. And I didn't think that was, I didn't know, I knew something was wrong. Something wasn't right. But the last thing that was the drinking. The last thing. Even to the point of, when I got that first drunk driving in Detroit, I thought, it's the drugs. I'll stop doing the drugs. I did some drugs, I'll admit. It's part of my story, but I don't dwell on it. Because for the next year, after that first drunk driving, I didn't really do any drugs. But I drank a lot after that. It was every day, all day. I was old enough to go to the bars. I went to the bars. I played pool. I did everything, and it was every day. And then it started to get to be all day every day. I was plowing snow over the winter. And I had this long route out in the middle of Michigan, and usually you do that starting about midnight. You get home at like 7 or 8 in the morning, and the stores are closed. I can't get in. So you buy something ahead of time so you have something in the morning, and then, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm in the middle of Michigan. I need a little pick-me-up. I'll just take a shot. That'll juice it, and that kind of stuff. And it's just kind of a slippery slope from there, So I got to this point, I was hanging out at my friend's house, and I remember thinking to myself, we were in that stage of there's no more snow for the season, and we hadn't started cleaning up and then doing the lawns yet. So I had this few weeks of nothing, and I'm like, I'm drinking all the time. I'm drinking every day, all day. I'm not stopping. And 4 days later, I got arrested for my second drunk driving. And when I got pulled over, the officer came up to the car and he says, "Have you been drinking tonight?" And I just turned to him. I said, "Yep," because that's all I had. There was nothing else. I didn't know what else. I was beyond caring about anything at that point. It was like, I wasn't going to fight it. There was no way. I was hammered. I remember a lot of that night. The first drunk driving, I blew a .2. The second one, I blew a .24. And I remember that night. Yeah, as we used to say a lot when I was first in sobriety, I only got caught twice. But I drank and drove every single day. Every single day. And if you would have seen my car then, I was driving a beat up old, I beat it up, Chevy Cavalier that was missing both of the mirrors. The one had been knocked off at some point. The other one, for a while, it still had the cup that held the mirror. The mirror was gone because it got knocked out. But I remember there was one night I was driving home on this road that I went every day, and there was a curve in it, and it was a 50 mile an hour, and I was doing 50 around a curve, and another guy was doing 50 around a curve, and we hit mirrors, at 50 miles an hour, and knocked my mirrors off. No, we didn't stop. 2 o'clock in the morning. But that's how close. Those are the things I look back on and go, oh, I was literally that close. So I got arrested again, and I woke up in the holding cell at the small township station where I was being held, and they were getting ready to transfer me over to the county. And I've traveled around a bit since I was in Michigan, and I realized that every area sort of has, their big area where people go, and up in Michigan it's 1200 Telegraph, so it's 1200 Telegraph Road. That's the name of the building, right? That's what everybody calls it. They don't call it the county lockup or anything like that. They just refer to it by the address. And the same thing was, it was this 33 Monroe in Orlando. So everybody refers to the building as just the address. They don't say what it is. So they transferred me over to 1200 Telegraph, where there was this big gym. They must have been full that week or something like that, because they just had me go into the gymnasium and grab a mat and lay on the floor, right? And there's like 100 dudes in this gymnasium of this place. And I'm laying on the floor, and I'm starting to shake a bit, and I didn't know what was going on. I knew at that point, up and even, all the stuff that had happened in there, I was blacking out. I was miserable. I didn't know what the problem was. I hated myself. I couldn't figure out life. Everything was just really, really dark. And I know that everybody in this room understands that. And so I'm laying on the floor of 1200 Telegraph and thinking, my life is going to change. There's no way at this point that my life is not going to change in some significant way at this point, right? In order to try to take some control over how that's going to change, I was coming up with options, And the first option that came up was someone was going to bail me out. So when I bail me out, I'm just going to pack up what I can get in my car, and I'm just going to drive away and just go somewhere, right? That's about as far as that plan got. The next idea was I will get out of trouble. I will pay whoever bails me out their bail money or whatever, and kind of deal with the circumstances and then go, So run away later. Those are the first two options that came. The next option that popped into my head for some reason was I could stop drinking, which was immediately followed by the thought of I can eat a bullet, right? Because that's what not drinking meant to me at that point. I mean, I wasn't like pondering what would happen if I stopped drinking. No, it was I thought I could stop drinking, I could eat a bullet. So the scariest part of that was that by the time someone came to bail me out, I had come to terms and was willing to do either of any of those options, depending on how things went when I got out. You know, I was at wit's end really about it. But I had determined that those were the options. Fortunately, my older brother and his wife came to pick me up, and they brought my 5-year-old niece with them, and we were walking across the parking lot of, the 1200 Telegraph, and I realized obviously at that point that I wasn't going to kill myself. But I still really didn't understand what was going on or what I would do. I got in front of the court, and basically, besides all the other stuff, the judge said, okay, clearly you have a problem with alcohol. You need to go to the AA meetings. You're going to go to 2 a week for the duration of your probation. I'm like, oh, okay, fine. I think I'd started already before that, but before the end of that. But ultimately what happened was on May 2nd of 1994, I walked into my first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. And I walked in the door, and I was skinny and not looking probably real healthy, really long hair. And I walked in the door, there's a guy who just greets me, hey, how you doing? My name's, what was his name? Tom, I think his name was Tom. I said, hey, how you doing? I'm like, I'm good. He's like, you new here? I'm like, how did he know? How did he figure that out? It's like, yeah, I'm new. I've never been to an AA meeting before. Okay, great. Come with me. He walks me across the room, gets me a cup of coffee. He's like, okay, here, sit down. We're gonna get some phone numbers for you, and just sit there, and we'll be getting our things going real quick. All right, cool. So I'm sitting at the end. In Michigan, most of the meetings are tables, right? They're table meetings. So if you had a room like this, those 3 tables would be split out into 3 areas with chairs around them, and each, we'd start the meeting like this, and then everybody would go to their tables, and each table would have their own discussion, right? And so I'm sitting at this table. There's 2 tables in the room, and I'm 22, skinny little dude, and there's like everybody at the table's guys, and they're in their at least probably 50s, yeah. I was going to say 40s, but I'm not going to give them that much credit. They were all in their 50s, 60s, whatever, sitting around a table. And we're getting ready to start, and just as we're getting ready to start, the door opens up, and 2 teenage boys and a girl walk in. And the guys went to this other table, and the girl sat down right next to me. So I was like, I'm sitting around this table with all these old dudes and this hot blonde right here, man. I'm like, okay, all right, whatever, let's go. I had no clue what was going on. And I really don't remember much else of that meeting outside of, the fact that one of the guys that walked in late is still my friend to this day. When I go to Michigan to visit. I visit with him almost as much as my family. We've been friends for 25 years almost now. The guy another guy at the other table, an older guy, became one of the other guys that was one of my influences early on. The guy who was leading my table was named Gene. We called him Mean Gene, because he was Korean War vet, always wearing a baseball cap, not quite flat, always had like a Navy insignia on it or whatever. They had the glasses on that were brown going to clear, had a mustache that was, gray, black, yellow, and his fingernails were long and yellow. He talked like this, but Gene was awesome. Gene, the only thing that I remember anybody saying at that first meeting was what Gene said at some point. He said, as of now, sitting in this room, you have all the tools available to you to stay sober one day at a time for the rest of your life, if you want to. The only reason that you have to drink anymore is if you want to, which I didn't understand what he was trying to get at. And I didn't even really remember all that at the time. But what he was trying to say was he knew that I was thinking I needed to drink. And he was telling me that that was a lie. And he was right. So Gene, Chris, my friend I was telling you about, the younger guy, Chuck, those three guys were at that meeting, my first meeting. I knew a guy from high school. There was a big group of kids when I was in high school that got sober because one of our friends flipped 8 times or 9 times his vet, on the ice, and was in a coma for 6 days, and he ended up getting sober and all this kind of stuff. So there was kind of a group, and I knew one of them, and I knew one was still around, and I was hoping I'd run across him, and I did. His name was Ernie. Ernie's 8 months younger than me, and he has 5.5 years more than I do. Ernie, I ended up, at some point, I rented a room out of Ernie's house for 4 years early in sobriety, and we had a lot of good times, and we had a lot of good discussions, and we would run some book meetings and stuff like that too out of the house. And then Mike was the other guy, and Mike was a good friend of Chuck that I met at some other meetings, and Mike he was my first sponsor, the sponsor I went through the steps with. So anyway, that first meeting, I got out of that first meeting, and my dad picks me up. Again, I'm 22 years old, and my dad has to pick me up like it was like, baseball practice in high school or something like that. The other strange thing, let me just, go back for just a second. That meeting was in a high school art room. And when I think back about it, the only time that I was ever really comfortable when I was a kid was when I was in art school or when I was in an art class. So I was sitting in an art room for my first meeting. That was just a side note. Make of that what you will. I didn't know if I was alcoholic or not. I got out of the meeting, my dad picks me up and he says, "Well, how'd it go?" And I was thinking of the hot blonde. And I thought, there's some hope there. But she probably was like, "Oh, this is great. He really is." Oh, no. Anyway, again, I digress. So I was determined that I didn't want to be in trouble. I had made that decision, and so I was going to do whatever the guy with the black robe and the big hammer was telling me to go to 2 meetings a week. I'm going 2 meetings a week. And I got rides to meetings. I had to because my license was suspended. So either my dad or I met some people. I'd call. Then picking up that phone to call someone to take me to a meeting was one of the hardest things I ever did. I mean, they talked about it when I was getting sober. About the 500-pound phone. And it's true. It's really. I understand how difficult it can be to pick up the phone and say, "Help me," even if it's just for a ride. But I did. So then I get within that, from May 2nd to August 6th, there were about 3 times that I drank, maybe 4, and there were different stages of me deciding or trying to figure out whether I was alcoholic or not. I'm going to go out, end up meeting with some of my friends who had dropped me by the wayside at this point, but they've called. "Oh, well, we haven't seen you in like 3 weeks. Okay, let's go out. I'm not going to drink," and then I would drink, or "I'm only going to drink this," and then I would drink more. Things like that, And then the last one was my birthday. It was a planned drink. I had planned it for about a month with a guy that I was working with. He said, "We're going to go to the bar for your birthday after work." I'm like, "All right, cool." So he decided not to go with me that day. So I went to the bar they used to hang out at, and I was waiting for a couple of my other friends to pick me up to take me home later. So of course I get to the bar, "Hey Mike, where you been? Oh, hey, what's up? I was gonna have 3 beers. 3 beers. So 6 Molson Ices later, and about 3 or 4 shots of Yukon Jack later, because of course you're at the bar and they're like, "Hey, it's your birthday." "Yeah, it's my birthday." "Oh, give them a shot." So I went home for cake and ice cream with my family, hammered, in the middle of the afternoon after work. And I remember walking in the door and seeing the look on my dad's face when he realized that I was drunk. And I can see it right now. And I just sort of was crestfallen at that point, even more so than he was. And so we had cake and ice cream with my niece, who's 5, and my little brother, who's 9, and the rest of my family. And then we decided to have a fire down at the lake, and my brother had some friends over, and I drank them out of their schnapps. And then another friend came to pick me up to take me out to this other friend's party, and went over there. And I remember this is the guy I used to drink the vodka with. Got to his house, and it was just the 2 of us, and he had a bottle of Jim Beam, and it was me and him and 2 girls, and there were more people going to be showing up. And we started, well, what are we going to do? Let's drink this. So I remember cracking open that bottle, and then waking up the next morning, and had to go to work at the car wash that I was working at. And that's when I was like, okay. The things you guys were saying around these meetings was true. I was an alcoholic, was powerless over alcohol, and I didn't want anything else that you guys had. I didn't. Those steps up there, I told you about my family history with church, and it was my misunderstanding of church and religion and God and all that stuff, of the idea that, I didn't know that you could separate out church and God and religion. I thought they're all the same thing. So if one's bad, all of it's bad, So for the next 8 months, roughly, I didn't drink. I went to meetings. I hung out with sober people. I did sober things. I went to 5 or 6 meetings, like I said, a week, as many as I can get rides to. I really enjoyed that whole part of it. On the weekends, my buddy Ernie would pick me up, and we'd go to some of the clubhouses around and go to dances and do all that fun stuff. And it is fun stuff, and it's important, to understand that sober life is not dull. But I really didn't want anything else until I was about 8 months without a drink. And I had improved my job at that point. I was working an overnight shift at a machine shop. And my sponsor at that time, Chris, my friend from up north, picked me up. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. I was working an overnight. And my life had come crumbling down, mostly in here. My circumstances in my life weren't so bad, but my life was crumbling down inside of my head. Because I was still me, and that was catching up to me. And I'm sitting in this car outside of my house, crying my eyes out at 3 o'clock in the morning, going, why does it still suck? And he said, do you believe that there's a power greater than yourself? And I said, I don't know. And he said, okay. And that was a big step for me to take, from going from I know there's no God to I don't know if there's a power greater than myself. So he said, okay, that's good, that's fine. He goes, do you believe that I believe there's a power greater than you and me? I said, yeah, I believe that. He's like, that's good enough. Okay. Says, go inside, and you hadn't had a drink today, get down on your knees and say, thank you for keeping me sober today. That's it. And then get up in the morning, if you don't want to take a drink that day, get down on your knees and say, please keep me sober today. Get up and go about your day. Do that for 30 days. If you don't like the results that you get, you can go back and do whatever you were doing before. As I learned later, it was called, we will refund your misery. There is nobody here that is going to keep you here if you don't want to be here. I want to be here. I asked my second sponsor, Mike, I asked him one time, I go, how long do I have to go to meetings for? Some of you know the answer to this, don't you? Yeah.
You hear that popping sound.
Yeah, until you want to. It was his answer. I was like, oh, okay. That sucks. Because I didn't want to yet at that point. Anyway, so I did that. And by the end of that 30 days, I had forgot that I even made that deal. I mean, I forgot about it like within the first week probably that I even made that deal. I was just doing it, and it was already starting to show improvement, and we had moved on. We got together and read the third step, and we did the third step prayer, so I'm kneeling in front of the couch in my living room with this other dude, and we're reading the third step prayer and saying the third step prayer, and I'm like, okay, yeah, this is cool, okay, sure, what do I do now? So I go, okay, you can start writing now. Okay, I'll start doing that. During this point, I was starting to do my 4-step, and I realized that he would be a better friend than a sponsor. He's got a year and a half more than I do, but he's 6 years younger than I am. And this other guy, Mike, that I was telling you about, I was really starting to click with what he was saying, And here's the other trick about Mike and Chuck. They would always sit together in meetings, and when you walked into the room, they were the ones that were going to be laughing. If anybody was laughing in that room, they were laughing. So if I wanted to feel good that day, I sat with them. If I wanted to moan and complain, I didn't sit with them. I sat with all the newcomers. Anyway. So I asked Mike to be my sponsor. He says, well, where are you? I'm in the middle of my 4-step. Okay, keep doing that. We'll get together. We'll talk. Okay. And the 4-step was simple enough. Write down all the people that you're angry with. I can do that, Although I wanted to be thorough, right? So what was the first thing that I did? Got my high school yearbook out. After I went through the family, of course, I opened up the yearbook and I said, if I see anybody in here and I'm still angry with them for some reason, then obviously I'm still angry with them and I need to deal with it, right? So if I looked at them and I was like, write them down. Because I wanted to be thorough, right? I wanted to figure this out. Then the rest of the columns, though, were a little more difficult. What was I afraid of? Well, at least fortunately, it's like sort of a multiple choice at that point. If you go through the big book, they give you 5 choices, right? I can pick, 1, 2, or 3 of those for each of these things, and that's fine, we'll do that. So it took me, I was a couple of weeks in the works, right? And I'm talking to Mike, and I'm like, let's set up time to do the 5th step. He's like, okay, we'll set up time. We set up time. And we were like going to meet at one of the local diners, right? And I'm like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know what we're going to do after we meet at the diner, right? So I get to the diner, I'm waiting, and he's not showing up. So I walk to the payphone, put a quarter in, called him up. Hey, where are you? Oh, were we supposed to meet tonight? I'm like, yeah. He's like, oh, yeah, I can't do that. How about next week, same time, same place? Okay, yeah, sure, okay. Hung up the phone, which gave me the opportunity to finish the list and put the stuff that I hadn't put on it yet on it. So we got together the next week. I'm sitting in the diner, and he comes in. He's got his big book with him. I got my list in hand. Chat for a minute or two, and he says, "So you ready? You ready? You want to do this?" I'm like, "Yeah, let's do it." I'm thinking, here? So he pulls out his book, and he's like, "Okay, we're going to pray the 3rd step prayer." Of course, he had been at this place a long time, so everybody knew him. So he pulls out his big book and goes to the 3rd step, and he's like, let's pray. Pray the 3rd step prayer, and he's like, okay. Puts some money on the table, and he's like, let's go outside. I'm like, okay, so we go to my car. Sitting in the car, my car, that's still beat up, the one that I drank in, sitting in my car for an hour and a half, going over my 4th step with him. And this is obviously not anything that I'd pictured it would be, I'd heard a lot of talk about spiritual stuff around here up until that point, so I'm like, maybe we'll go back to his house and we'll be in his living room and there'll be maybe some candles. I don't, who knows? Who the hell knows what this spiritual stuff really is? It's like kind of, there was this mid-90s, so there's like this new age type of thing going, I don't know. Who knows what it was? I didn't know. So I'm sitting in my car doing my 5th step with him. And I'll put it this way. What I realized is that I lived in a complete and utter fantasy world. Like, something would happen to me, I would have an emotional reaction to it, I would immediately leap to a conclusion, and then I would immediately assume that that conclusion was absolutely correct and act upon it. And most of the time, I was dead wrong. Because every time I told him something, that I was upset with, he came up with like at least 3 or 4 plausible other scenarios of what was actually happening. And they were probably more plausible than what I was talking about, you know? And I'm like, oh my God, I am an idiot. I have no idea what the hell is going on. That was basically my reaction to that. But man, I felt good too, because there was some stuff that I had done that I hadn't told anybody. You know, I thought, I'm like, oh, I'm so special. I am so unique. I am so bad that I did these things. Like no one probably has ever done these things, right? Except for the fact he says, you know that thing that you did? I'm like, yeah. He's like, you just called it something, right? I'm like, yeah. He's like, that's because other people have done it before. That's the kind of fantasy world that I lived in. Like I thought, I was unique, come on. Man. But not me, yeah, oh me. Yeah, me. So anyway, so that was my like biggest like, oh my gosh, relief, and like, I was like vibrating coming out of there. Not because I'd had any, it was just a really good experience as far as that goes for me. I know I've heard other stories, but to suffice it to say is I came out of that knowing that I am capable of being delusional, which it talks about in the book. We can be and I was firmly understood that now. Went home and of course, you know, read the couple of paragraphs, 6 and 7, you know, contemplate, you know, say the 7-step prayer, and then write another list. Okay, started to write another list. Now, a lot of this list was the same people that were on the 4-step list, but now I had to think about how I had, you know, wronged them, what I had done, you know. I ended up writing that list, of course, and then I finally told my sponsor, I said, Mike, I got that list done. He's like, okay, good. Come over to my house, you know, about 5 o'clock or whatever on such and such a day, and we'll go over it. Don't do anything. You know, that was the thing. Don't do anything with that list. Come over to my house first. We'll talk about it. I'm like, okay. So I went over to his house, and I've known this guy for a year now. This is the first time I knew where he lived, because this is the first time he told me where he lived. That gives you a clue of where I was at. So I show up at his house, and I'm sitting in his kitchen. Is it the same down here where all conversations in a house happen in the kitchen? Okay, just checking. Midwest for sure. A lot of kitchens up in the Midwest are bigger than the living rooms because that's where everything happens. But anyway, so I'm in his kitchen, he makes me tea, and he's making dinner for his wife, and we're chatting, going over the list, and game planning. I had ideas. He told me to bring ideas of what I thought I needed to do to fix the situations that I had gotten into, you know, and we game planned. Like, that's good, that's a good idea, that's okay, good, no, don't do that. Maybe you want to do this, that sort of stuff, right? The one that stuck out to me was, like, when I was at the job cutting lawns, every once a while on a Friday, I wasn't, you know, they weren't paying me enough. I was really good. There's gas cans sitting right there full of gas that we didn't use for the day, so my tank's a little empty, so that 5 gallons goes in my car. So I added that up to what I thought I might owe him, and I thought to myself, $80, and I wrote down $80. And I said, you know, I'm gonna just pad it a little bit, because I wanna make sure it's good. I'll put 100. And when I was talking to Mike, I said, I think I owe him about 100. And he goes, make it 120. I'm like, okay. Because I was willing, really, to get this at that point. So we game planned. And he said, don't do any of these until you're ready to do these. And like, what do you mean? He's like, you need to be willing. It talks about it in the 8th step. Willing to do these things. You don't just do them, you know. You have to be at a point where if you go into this situation, and it's maybe a bad situation because, you know, you've hurt these people, and they start pushing buttons or punching back or whatever, you need to be able to not make it worse. Oh, okay. So I just can't go blindly saying I'm sorry like I used to. I have to get comfortable with me and what I did and comfortable with how they might react and understand that they can have those reactions. Most of them are probably legit because I wronged them in some way. But I have to be at a point where it's, I'm not going to make it worse. That's the whole point. Don't make it worse. This is about fixing these things. So he says, pick an easy one. You'll do that one first. And it was my former employer at the landscaping company. So I got my checkbook, and I figured I was ready at some point. It was a few days later or whatever. Got the checkbook, figured out how I wanted to tell him as best my ability. How am I going to do this? And I wasn't working for him at the time, but I drove over, and I was driving down a road, and I got to where I would pull in, and I kept driving. And I'm like, oh no, okay, God, I need to do this. God, I really need to do this. So I turned around and I drove back, and I'm like, God, I really want to do this. And I kept driving past it again. And then I turned around again, and I pulled in, parked, and he was there, and went and knocked on the door, sat down, chatted with him, caught up a little bit, and I said, hey, look, by the way, why I'm here really is, I used to steal from you. I used to take gas and put in my car, and that's what I did. And if you would, I would like you to accept the money that I think I owe you for that. Not, I got a check here, take it. No, I was like, let them make the decision. This is my option. I'm presenting. If you accept that, great. But if there's negotiation, then hey, there's negotiation. He sits back and he goes, well, yeah, that's great, sure. So I pulled out my checkbook and wrote him the check. How much? I'm starting writing a check. He said, how much do you think you owe me? I was like, I'm going to write a check for $120. It's like, $120? Like, yeah, I didn't tell him I padded it a little bit. Anyway, we concluded the discussion. I, wished him well. He wished me well. He was happy that I wasn't drinking because he was the guy that would meet me on my way to walk into the office with a cup of coffee on the sidewalk. There you go, because he knew that if he wanted me to work really well that day, that I needed coffee. I drove out of that. I was driving down the driveway of the yard like I had done many times before. And I don't claim a white light experience, but the sky was a little brighter. It was overcast in Michigan. The clouds had broke a little bit, just to let a little bit more light through in a spot. It happens, but it was kind of bright. And I thought, oh, there is this God. There is this power greater than myself. I get it. Oh. And if I do this stuff that I've been doing for the last few months, as a lifestyle or every day for the rest of my life, one day at a time or whatever, I could stay sober, and I had gotten to the point where I was enjoying it. It felt pretty good. So that was my spiritual awakening, which I didn't get because it says spiritual awakening in the 12 steps. So I was waiting for the 12th step to have my spiritual awakening, so I just blasted through right there. Didn't even really know that was it until later. This is how deluded I am at this point. Because it says spiritual awakening in the 12th step, not in the 9th step, 12th step. But I had mine in the 9th. Because I got done with the work. I started to do the work. I had that spiritual experience. I had a spiritual awakening. I continued to do the rest of the 9th step and do all those things that they say to do. And, here I am, 24 years later, without having taken a drink. So yeah, I was 4 when I got sober. No, sorry. I had someone ask me that, somewhat sarcastically, in Orlando. Oh, you've been sober for, I think it was 16. You've been sober for 16 years? What'd you get sober for? No. No, not at 4. But anyway, I spoke one time when I was 3 years sober in Cleveland at the 24-Hour Club. And I had been in a few weeks before that visiting with a guy that was living in our house who had been from there. And we were riding around in the car with his grand sponsor, Gary the Mailman, because I guess everybody knew Gary the Mailman in Cleveland. But he was in charge of getting speakers for the 24-Hour Club. So I drove in one time to do that. Because we were driving around in his car, he's like, "So, Mike, you've been sober for 3 years?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, what do you think of it?" I'm like, "I love it." He's like, and he told me that later. He said, "That's why I asked you to speak at the club, was because you said you loved being sober." And I do, even when it's not great. Even when I've had plenty of bad shit happen to me in sobriety. I can't live 24 years of my life without having things happen. But regardless of any of that, I love it. I love being sober. I hated myself when I was out there. I hated everything about it. But I didn't know there was a different way to do it. But I love it. And I still do to this day. So that's why I'm really glad that I was able to come up here and share that with you guys. So thanks. That's all I got.